is, do they actually help longevity? Because I think that is, or better, like healthy aging, health span, whatever we want to name it. But like, do they actually help with that, or they can maybe cause problems?
So there's been a lot of clinical trials now, many more for NR. NMN has some that have come out recently, but there's a lot more trials for NR especially. And there's been shown, especially in preclinical studies, so in animal and cell studies, that it has huge benefits. You know, boosting NAD does everything from improving metabolic function to repairing DNA damage to improving cognitive function, you know, neurodegeneration, muscle wasting, like you name it, NAD seems to help with it. And this is in preclinical studies. Then when it's gone into human clinical trials, the results haven't been so startling, and it seems like, you know, these amazing results that they're getting in cells and animals aren't quite translating through into humans. And there's been a lot of research now into like why that may be. And, you know, one of the main reasons is that NR and NMN are simply not addressing the root causes of why NAD is actually declining in the first place. So usually when something's declining in the body, there's a reason for it. And what NR and NMN do is they don't look at what that reason is. They just go, okay, just put more raw material in and hopefully we'll get more NAD out the other end. But what we now know is a lot of studies have demonstrated that there are two main things that are going on in our body to cause NAD decline. The first is that our NAD production and recycling pathway in our cells declines with age. So what happens is that when NAD is used up, during repair and things like that, it's actually broken down into precursors, and the precursor it's broken down into is nicotinamide. Then what would usually happen in our healthy young cells is this nicotinamide would literally be scooped back up in a pathway called the salvage pathway, which recycles this precursor straight back into fresh NAD again. So it's a kind of clever pathway because it means that as NAD use goes up, there'll be more breakdown products, and this pathway gets turned up and it recycles it back into more NAD to fulfill the demand for NAD. But what we now know is that as we become older, this pathway declines. So specifically, there's an enzyme in this pathway called NAMPT. This is the enzyme that declines, and it's a rate-limiting enzyme, which basically means the level of this enzyme directly dictates how much NAD will be made. So if the levels of this enzyme go down, you'll get less NAD. And we find that levels of this enzyme do decline during aging, which means that NAD simply can't be recycled as it's being used up, and this is why you begin to get a deficit. So if you look at a precursor like NR or NMN, it's ignoring this problem. So it's kind of like if you think of a factory, if the cell is a factory, you are saying, oh my goodness, production's gone down in the factory, how do we fix it? We can see all the machines are broken, but let's ignore that and let's just ship more raw material in and hope more NAD comes out the other end. You know, that is essentially what is happening. So the other thing is we now also know that that's not the only problem. The second problem is inflammation. So chronic low-grade inflammation, we all suffer from it as we get older, and we know that it causes increased expression of a protein or an enzyme called CD38 on our cells. And CD38 uses up NAD. In fact, it's a prolific NAD consumer. It uses so much and wastes it to drive further inflammation. So again, we know that we have more CD38, which is using more NAD. And again, if you think of precursors like NR or NMN, if you are boosting your NAD levels, but you're not inhibiting CD38, then it's likely that a lot of this NAD that you are increasing is actually getting used by CD38 rather than other important processes like DNA repair enzymes, which also use NAD, or the sirtuins, which are crucial longevity genes, which also use NAD. And the reason we know this is because it's been calculated that CD38 has a higher affinity for NAD than the repair processes, which basically means that if NAD is available in the cell, CD38 will grab onto it strongly and use it before any of the more beneficial processes even get a look in. So, you could be thinking, oh, I'm doing this good thing, I'm using NMN or NR to boost my NAD, but if you've got high expression of CD38, that NAD is actually driving inflammation. So by not fixing the root causes, you can be actually making other things worse.
Yeah, that sounds a little bit scary, because it's like I'm taking this to feel better, but I might be increasing my low-grade inflammation, which is one of the hallmarks of aging.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting, and that's actually how I came to know about your company, Nuchido. And first of all, I think your story is super inspiring in terms of you transitioning from the medical world and research in terms of developing pharmaceutical, which if you want you can talk a little bit about, to then be like, well, I actually want to make a difference today by creating something that actually helps people in the here and now. And so just for the viewers, for a little bit of context, we both, Nuchido and Beyond Sapiens, were at the same trade show in London 1 month ago, I think. And that's where I actually got to know about Nuchido, and I was like, well, this sounds super cool, just because, in the longevity world, everyone is talking about NMN and NR. And I think they're not necessarily a bad thing, but I think now it has been quite a few years since we have been talking about NMN and NR. And I think, as in everything in research and science, it's time to level up to a second generation kind of NAD booster. Or in this case, I know it's not just a booster, but it does more. So with that being said, my question to you is, how does your product, Nuchido Time Plus, differ from NMN and NR?
Yeah, well, you kind of, you touched on it there about, so my background is in drug development. Before I started a supplement company, I actually, I worked developing drugs, and I was fortunate enough to work on projects that were looking at drugs that were designed to slow cellular aging. Which, is quite out there in terms of drug development. It's quite forward thinking. But the things that frustrated me were there were a lot of molecules that we were testing that worked really well in drug development, but because they weren't patentable, because they were natural molecules, drugs companies simply aren't interested in giving them the research or testing that they deserve, which commercially, makes sense. Why would you put hundreds of millions into something that you can't own? But ethically, it didn't sit right with me that we were literally putting in the bin molecules that were working fantastic and putting all that money into developing something that worked half as well. So I left that world in 2017 to found Nuchido. And the whole mission was, how can we take the latest science and really develop it into products or supplements that people can take now, but equally that have good science behind them and good clinical testing. And NAD was obviously this area of research that was a right hot topic, back at that time. There was a lot of research coming out that showed the benefits of it. This is when things like NR and NMN were really just emerging. And even at that time, I was looking at NMN and NR and saying, well, it's great that there's this data, but it's also becoming very clear that they're not addressing the root causes. So, if we're going to develop a product, we want to do, the next generation of NAD supplements. We want to, bring something out that reflects the latest science. So what we did was we designed a product that not only had a precursor in it, but also had lots of different other ingredients in that were all designed to fix the root causes of NAD decline. So interestingly, a lot of people say to us, well, why have you not used NR or NMN as your precursor? Because we actually use something called nicotinamide. And the reason we use nicotinamide is because nicotinamide is actually the best precursor in terms of bioavailability, and it's the precursor that our bodies naturally use to make the largest amount of the largest proportion of NAD. So that's the reason why we use nicotinamide. It doesn't require any transporters to get in the cells. It freely diffuses across membranes, and we know it where it gets to where you want it to get to in the body. Unlike NR and NMN that do require transporters, and there's also a huge amount of debate about whether things like NR actually just get metabolized to nicotinamide and then taken up by the cells anyway. So we just sort of stayed out of that whole argument and just went straight for the nicotinamide because it does work just as well. We then were like, okay, what are the main things that we want to address here? So we want to switch back on NAMPT. So we have several ingredients in there that do that. We have an ingredient called rutin, which contains an active called quercetin, which is an NAMPT activator. We also have alpha lipoic acid in there, which is also acting to induce, mimic the effect that you have when you're fasting, to again switch on that pathway. So we see increased levels of NAD salvage and recycling in the cells. We've also got ingredients in there to inhibit CD38, that inflammatory enzyme. So we've got apigenin in there in the form of parsley powder, which does that. I should probably point out we have a lot of actives that aren't put in their pure form, but in a more natural form. So things like parsley powder for apigenin, rutin instead of quercetin, and this is because they are much more bioavailable. You know, it's fair enough putting pure active ingredients on cells and they work in cell culture, but when you try and take them orally, they don't do the same thing, and this is because they often get destroyed by the gut. So if you can put them in their more natural form, it protects them until they actually get to the cells. We also have inhibitors in there of a methylating enzyme, which we haven't spoke about, but quite often what happens in our cells as we get older is we get increased levels of methylation, which tries to also inhibit that recycling of NAD. So we have green tea in there, which contains EGCG, which also inhibits that enzyme. So, you know, we like to talk of it as a multi-targeted approach. So every little thing that's going wrong in that NAD production network, we've got something in the product that's actually addressing it and trying to fix it.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing approach. First of all, also the fact that you are also trying to using nature in terms of, because at the end of the day, all the molecules, they are in nature, most of them.
Yeah.
And so I think it's great that you do that. And I think it's also really brave what you did in terms of turning your career upside down and just taking the leap. I think one of the amazing things about your product is that it's not just, yes, we created this, it works, but you actually have data that proves it, and not just a simple study, but it's a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover study. So if you could maybe translate what this thing that I just said means for our viewers to make it more simple, and also most important to understand what this study actually showed.
So a placebo-controlled, double-blinded crossover study is what we performed, which is the gold standard in terms of clinical testing. So double-blinded basically just means that the researchers performing the test and the people analysing the data didn't know which was the real thing and which was the placebo. The fact that it was placebo-controlled, you know, it's obvious what that does. It accounts for the placebo effect if someone knows they're taking something. The fact that it's a crossover study, what that means is that, so we had 28 people in the study, and rather than them being split into two groups of 14, where half of the people only ever took the placebo and half of them only ever took the real thing, which is very often what usually happens, the fact that it's a crossover meant that every single person took the placebo. They then had a washout phase, and then every single person took the real thing. And some people, that they were split in that some people ended up having having the real thing first, then a washout, then the placebo, and the other people had the placebo first and then the real thing. So what it means is that everybody is their own control. So rather than taking a group of diverse, biologically diverse people on the placebo, then a completely separate biologically diverse set of people on the real thing, and then comparing them, which isn't a very good comparison, you can literally take a person and be like, this is what happened to them on the placebo, this is what happened to them when they took the real thing, and it's the same human being. So it's a much better trial design, but also a bit trickier and longer to do. But yeah, so we wanted to do this. Clinical trials are not required for supplements, believe it or not.
I know the supplement industry is very there's a little bit of a gray area, and I think this is why we are partnering up with Nuchido for this reason, because for our clients we want to ensure that they get the latest and greatest backed by science products. And I think you also having the willingness to go in deep into this and be like, okay, I could just do a simple study, but actually want to do. And I guess this also stems from all of your background transition into your entrepreneurial journey.